Yeah, appreciate it, Matthew. Okay, I want to make sure, can everybody hear me in the back? Okay. So, there's a debate in my family. I've been married 26 years, and I say that I have a very loud voice, and my wife says I have a very big mouth. So I'll let you guys can give me a verdict when we're done today. So I want to just kind of give you a brief background on me and why I'm here, how I came to be here today. Mostly what I want to do today is answer a bunch of questions, and that's always the most productive part because you guys are the smartest people in the room. You'll ask the best questions, and we can cover a lot of ground that way. My background professionally is I'm a lawyer. Don't hold that against me, please. I'm a recovering lawyer. I haven't practiced law for a long time. And in my practice originally, the beginning of my practice was business and real estate. About halfway through my career in the early 90s, I'm dating myself here, but in the early 90s, the early days of the internet, I became one of the first lawyers who was expert on the law in the internet. And so I had this kind of perfect life as I saw it. I lived in the country in Northern California. I had 2 young kids at the time, and I was teaching them to ride horses. I was coaching soccer, and I was working from home. I was just absolutely incredible. I took them to school and picked them up every day, helped them with their homework, everything a dad could want. And then the Tea Party movement happened. And I saw Rick Santelli do his now famous rant from right here, right on the floor of the Chicago Merc. And he called for a new American Tea Party. And I was inspired by that. I held one of the first protests. That was in Sacramento, California. 150 people showed up. It kind of blew my mind that there were 150 people as crazy as me in California that came out, right? California, just like here, is a very blue state. And so you get this perspective that maybe there's nobody else out there like you. And that was one of the most inspiring things to me about the beginning of the Tea Party movement is how many people there were out there that thought like me, what we now know as the silent majority in America. After the very first protest, there were not a lot of people know about it. There were 35 Tea Parties around the country. 39,000 people came out. That's February 27th of 2009. A group of us got together and decided we should do this again. If we were that successful, 1 week's notice, maybe we could have 75 or 80 Tea Parties around the country, and maybe we could stir some stuff up. And so we proposed to do them on April 15th. Seems like everybody's mad at the government already on April 15th. So we proposed Tax Day Tea Party. Anybody ever hear of the Tax Day Tea Parties? Yeah. So 850 of them happened. It spiraled out of control. Ultimately, for me, it took over my life. 1.2 million people came out on April 15th, 2009. By the way, most people don't know this. That's the largest single-day multi-city protest in world history. It's pretty amazing that happened. And out of that, then you get the 2010 elections. That was the biggest swing between parties since 1938. Anybody vote in that election? Yeah, thank you guys for making that happen. And I was so excited after those elections. I was heading up an organization called Tea Party Patriots. Ultimately, we built that to 23 million members, 3,200 chapters. I was there the night of the elections in 2010. We had a huge party on Capitol Hill. I remember there were news cameras from all over the world. Everybody knew what was happening. I remember my daughter gave a speech on Japanese national television. Really incredible night. And I really thought that everything in Washington, D.C. was going to change. And those guys came in and they got sworn in as the new class. And I was there, by the way, for their swearing in. And I'm not kidding, within 3 days, they were eaten by the swamp, most of them. And when I say 3 days, I'm not exaggerating. The lobbyists had their hooks in those guys so fast, it was unbelievable. The Potomac, which everybody thinks of as a swamp, somehow turned into a jacuzzi for all these guys, right? And we thought everything was going to change, and nothing changed. And I was incredibly frustrated by this. I had, at this point, dedicated my life to this. I had shut down my practice. Penny and I knew nothing, my wife and I knew nothing about running a nonprofit organization. Nonprofit meant no money from our perspective, and we made no money, we had no salary, we spent all of our money. And we literally spent all the money we had ever saved helping to build up the Tea Party movement to the point of the edge of bankruptcy, literally. And we had a donor that came in very last minute and saved us from filing bankruptcy. And so I get to this point after 2010, 2011, 2012, and I realize nothing's changing. I've quit the practice of law. I used to say all the time that there is no amount of money in the world that could cause me to be on the road traveling away from my wife and my kids. And ultimately, for no amount of money. I traveled away from my wife and my kids. And it was so frustrating because we weren't actually accomplishing anything. And I would tell you that a lot of people who were engaged in the movement at that time, at my level, people who were building up organizations and maybe getting elected to office, they were really enamored with being in Washington, D.C. You know, at the time, I could go into D.C. and I could pick up the phone and I could have an appointment with John Boehner anytime I wanted. Anybody else in Congress that I wanted to have an appointment with. And I was not enamored with that. I'm not impressed with John Boehner or Kevin McCarthy or any of these folks any more, actually less than I am with being with you guys. So to me, being in Washington, D.C. was not a privilege, honestly. It was a burden. It was being away from my family. I didn't want to be there. I was there because I felt called to be there to try to do something to save the country. And then by 2012, I realized I wasn't doing anything to save the country. Right? I was appearing on Fox News talking about how frustrated I was about everything, and then I'd go home and these guys would do exactly the same thing they had always done. I remember being in Congress at some point and there was a huge debt ceiling fight going on. Anybody remember this thing called the debt ceiling, right? The debt ceiling, this thing where the Republicans are allegedly going to use the inability to borrow any more money to extract spending concessions. And I remember sitting in a congressman's office and watching all this debate going on the floor. I was watching from the monitors in a congressman's office, and I was excited. I was like really intense. And one of the congressman's staffers said, "You know that there's already a deal, right?" And I said, "What? What are you talking about?" He goes, "Oh, they're going to debate until an hour after the deadline for the debt ceiling, but the deal's already been cut. They're going to raise the debt ceiling, and everybody knows what's going to happen, and the Republicans really aren't going to get anything out of it." And I was completely blown away by that. It was all a charade. It was literally kabuki theater being put on for the American people. And he told me, look, if the Democrats don't fight until the last minute, then their constituents will scream at them. If the Republicans don't fight until the last minute, their constituents will scream at them. But everybody knows we're going to raise the debt ceiling, so it's already done. And I was just so disheartened by that and by the idea that there was theater going on in Washington, D.C. being performed for all of us, right? So that we wouldn't be mad at them. So we would think our guys did the best they possibly could. But it wasn't true. It was all fake. And so I just felt like I wasn't really accomplishing anything. In 2012, I left the organization that I had founded, the Tea Party Patriots, and I intended, frankly, at that point to leave politics. And my attitude was, look, I came into politics to try to do something good, to do what little I could do to try and save the nation. I'm not accomplishing that. So why am I away from my kids and my wife and my family and the place and the home that I love? And the answer was I didn't really have a good reason. And I got really blessed, to be honest with you. A guy who's one of my best friends now, his name's Tim Dunn. He's a West Texas oil guy. He's one of the donors. He's an original founding board member of our organization. Came to me and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know. I think I'm just going to go back to practicing law." And he said, "Oh, you can't leave politics." And I said, "Yeah, I can leave politics." And he said, "No, you got to stay. You're too good at what you do. You're pretty good on television, and you haven't compromised your ethics." That was the main thing. And I said, "Yeah, I would never do that." And he said, "Well, then me and some other guys will help fund you to start a new organization." And I said, "I have no idea what to do." And he said, "Well, that's okay. We don't either." Incredible to have somebody come to you and say that, like, just start something and figure it out. And we did. The very first thing we did is we raised $1 million to give away to grassroots groups on the ground. And this was super important to me because when I was in my time at Tea Party Patriots, almost no money went back to the grassroots on the ground. So I had friends all across the movement that were maybe renting churches on a Saturday evening and spending $100 a week to rent their local church to have Tea Party meetings. And so they're spending all this money out of their own pockets and nobody was helping them. And so I wanted to help them, so we did that. The second thing that we did, I think, proves my pedigree of being insane, because the second thing we did is I sued the IRS. Most people would say, "You clapped, you're crazy too." Most people would say that's crazy, and it was, but I had a lot of friends in the Tea Party movement that were being attacked by the IRS. They had filed for charitable registration status as what's called a 501c3 or C4 organizations, and the questionnaires they were getting was unbelievable. Things like, what are the content of the prayers that you say at your meetings? Hey, you know, we had Matthew up here just say a prayer. The IRS wanted to know what was the contents of that prayer. They wanted to know what books we were recommending people read. They wanted to know what was our donor list so they could go after people like you that were given $5 at the door. And so it was really ugly time and nobody was doing anything about it. I was watching TV and I was watching these television lawyers, the fancy lawyers on Fox News, talk about how bad it was what was being done to the Tea Parties. And I was calling those people and saying, are you going to sue or are you going to do something? And their answer was, well, we don't know. We'll have to see. And so I finally got frustrated enough that I went to a law firm that I knew in St. Louis and asked them if they would represent in a class action all these Tea Party people. And I went out and we raised the money to do it. It cost us $4.5 million to sue the IRS. We raised that money. That's hard money to raise because donors, you know, you like the idea of giving money to an organization suing the IRS? It's pretty, you know, you need crazy donors too. And so luckily we found the donors to do that over time, and the IRS a year ago this December settled for $3.5 million that went to the plaintiff's class. I'm not aware of anybody, by the way, ever getting a big multi-million-dollar settlement out of the IRS on anything else. So that was the second thing I did. The third thing was Convention of States. And the way that happened is I met somebody who is much, much smarter and much, much more accomplished than me, and that's a guy by the name of Mike Ferris. Now, most people wouldn't know Mike Ferris's name. Anybody in here homeschool their kids or come from a homeschool family? That's most people know Mike. Mike is, I would describe him as the founder of the homeschool movement in America. Back in the 70s, homeschooling was illegal in one way or another in all 50 states. And they didn't actually generally say you're not allowed to homeschool your kids. They would do crazy things like they would say, if you want to homeschool your kids, you have to be a certified teacher in every subject matter area. Right? Like nobody can do that. Or they would say, you have to meet all the physical requirements that a school has for its physical location, which is impossible for somebody schooling their kids at home. So they just managed to take what is a fundamental right of each of ours, which is to school our own children, educate our kids in the way we see fit, and they'd taken it away. And Mike Ferris said, that's just wrong. And Mike said, I'm going to fix that problem. And this is really an incredible thing. It's actually crazy. It's actually impossible what he set out to do, because back then when Mike set out to do this, and then there was no fax, or there was no cell phones and no internet. Imagine trying to build a national movement. High tech was a fax machine back then. And he built a national movement, and today, because of Mike and a lot of other people that worked with him, there's a lot of people all around the country, a lot of great organizations joined hands and were created. And you can now, we think of homeschooling, we all know people who homeschool their kids, it seems normal to us. But we take that for granted, I think. So Mike blazed that path. And he came to me one day and he said, he was introduced to me by Tim Dunn, this guy I was telling you about. And he said, you know, are you happy with what you've accomplished in politics? And I said, no, I'm really frustrated and upset. And I feel like I've wasted years of my life. And he said, that's because you're approaching the incorrect problem. You think we have a personnel problem in Washington, D.C. And I said, yeah, heck yeah, we do. And he said, well, maybe, but that's not the problem. The problem is actually a structure problem. We've broken the structure of our system of governance. And it doesn't matter what you put into a bad structure or a bad system, you're going to get a bad result. And that's what we're getting right now. And he walked me through a bunch of the broken structures of our government, things we had done, the way we have exceeded the enumerated powers, right? So our government is a government of limited enumerated federal powers. We've blown all those out. The Constitution has been blown up by the federal government and the courts. And he explained all this to me and he said, but there's a way to fix it. We can use Article 5 of the Constitution. And so Article 5 of the Constitution, for those of you who don't know, it provides the mechanism whereby we can propose amendments to our Constitution. You all know we've done it 27 times. There's two methods in Article 5 for proposing amendments to the Constitution. The very first, and the one we've used all 27 times, is when 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose an amendment, then it goes out to the people and the states for ratification by 3/4 of the states. And we've done that 27 times successfully. The second part of Article 5 says when 2/3 of states want to get together to propose amendments and they make a call for that convention, then the states gather in convention and then they propose amendments. They go out for ratification the same way by 3/4 of the states. We've never done that. And Mike told me that there's no way that the federal government is ever going to restrain itself, and so the people have to do it using this second method. And he started to educate me more and more about it. It took about an hour before I was just completely bought in. It made perfect sense to me If you have a broken structure, you get a broken result. Send good people into a bad machine, you get bad stuff coming out of the back of that machine. It all made sense to me, and I started to dig into the history. The history is really interesting. I'm a student of history. Anybody study history in here? More than since you were in school, probably? Yeah. Look, I went to school in Los Angeles, California. My history was bad. Let's just put it that way. Maybe Chicago, same thing, right? And so there's a lot of stuff I didn't learn. This is something I didn't learn. I didn't learn that September 15th is the most important day in American history. And people say July 4th or other days like that, right? September 15th is the most important day in American history to me because it's my wife's birthday. That's number 26 years I've learned a few things. Second is because that's the day the second clause of Article 5 gets introduced into the Constitution. It happens like this. September 15th, the convention's almost over. It's going to be 2 more days and the convention is over and the Constitution gets signed. But what happens is Colonel George Mason from Virginia stands up, he addresses the assembly, and he says something like this. We have a fundamental problem with this document we've drafted, that we've given Congress and the federal government the power and the authority to propose amendments, but we've not given the people acting through the states the same power. And then he asks a question, still an important question today. Are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Yeah, I see some people shaking their heads, some people giggling about that. It's ridiculous. No tyranny in all of human history has ever restrained its own tyranny. Can you imagine a tyrannical government saying, I think maybe we've overstepped a little, we have too much power, we ought to give some back to the people that we're tyrannizing, right? Never happened. I actually think the founders laughed at this point in convention. We don't have video or anything like that, but we have Madison's notes, right? Madison's notes are really good and really thorough. These guys debated everything, but at this point in the convention, the notes say nin com, which means no comment in Latin. Not one person objected to what Mason was saying. Not one objection, not one comment, no debate. They debated how to debate, but they didn't debate this. And in fact, they then voted unanimously to put the second clause of Article 5 in there that gives all of us this power to restrain federal tyranny. So here we are, 243 years later. Raise your hand if you think the federal government has become tyrannical. Anybody? Yeah. By the way, today, only 27% of American citizens say that the federal government has the consent of the governed. I want you to think about that. That's a terrifying statistic. The vast majority of people in this country believe that the federal government no longer has our consent, which is the very definition of a tyranny. They're governing us without our permission, which means they're not even governing us anymore. They are ruling over us. So we're frustrated by this. The founders knew that this time would come. And so that's what we're doing. We're using this gift that the founders gave us. It's 243 years later. We've never used it. I think we're a little late, but I think that's okay. We have not lost our country yet. And the question is, will we act? Let me describe to you kind of how the process works for those of you that are unfamiliar with it. Because we haven't used it ever before in history, it's not unusual that people wouldn't be familiar with it. Here's what the Article 5 says. It says that whenever 2/3 of states shall call, and the way a call works is this: a state legislature has to pass what's called a resolution. It's a joint resolution in both houses of the legislature calling for a convention of states. And that convention has to be on a particular subject. How do we know it has to be on a particular subject? Because we've had over 400 applications in American history, and we've never had a convention because we haven't had 2/3 of the states call it on the same subject. So we have a long historical record of this. And so when 2/3 of states call, then the states gather in convention. Each state will send as many delegates as it wants, but we'll get one vote. How do we know it's only one vote? Well, we had 11 conventions before 1787. We've had approximately 30 interstate conventions since, and the states only vote one state, one vote, because it is called a convention of states, not a convention of delegates, not a convention of populations, not a proportional convention. It is a convention of sovereign entities being states. Each state gets one vote, but they can send as many delegates as they want. Each state legislature will choose the delegates however they decide to choose. Some people don't like this. Personally, I'm a federalist. I think it's awesome. I think every state should decide the way they want to send as many as they want to send, and know that they only get one vote. They get into convention. At convention, they will adopt a set of rules. Get a lot of questions about what will the rules be at convention. And we actually have a pretty good idea what the rules will be. Again, there have been 41 conventions roughly since prior to 1787. They've used virtually identical rule sets in all of them. We know we have the rule sets from almost all of them, and we can look at them and compare them. They're virtually identical across the centuries. Today, 70% of state legislatures use something called Mason's rules. If you're not familiar with those, they're kind of like Robert's Rules of Order. Some of the legislatures actually use Robert's Rules, but about 70% use Mason's. So we believe likely that the convention will adopt a set of Mason's rules. If you want to see what this looks like, we hold a simulated convention a couple of years ago in Williamsburg. They used Mason's plus a couple specific rules for convention. In that convention, they'll probably break into committees a lot like a legislature. We have 3 subject matter areas in our resolution. One is anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Those are restraints like a balanced budget amendment, like imposing spending caps or taxation caps, maybe tied to GDP or tied to population plus inflation. It's anything that would impose term limits, not just term limits for Congress, but term limits potentially for the federal judiciary, for federal officials like staffers. How about bureaucrats, right? They're not supposed to be there forever. And then anything that would impose what are called scope and jurisdictional limitations on the federal government. And to me, this is the heart of the matter. Our republic was designed where the federal government was supposed to have limited enumerated powers and the state powers were supposed to be unenumerated and expansive. And today we flipped that on its head. So when I say anything that would put scope and jurisdictional limitations on the federal government, it's essentially returning to the enumerated powers, right? So no, you may not be involved in education. No, you may not be involved in the environment. No, you may not be involved in energy. None of those things are in the Constitution. Those are a creation of the courts. And so we want to go back to something like the enumerated powers. So in convention, they'll break into committees around those 3 subject matter areas. They'll debate proposed amendments. And if they can get 26 states to agree on any amendment, then they can pass that out of convention. Ultimately, that goes by a simple majority. So ultimately, they'll have 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 amendments proposed. They come out of convention, and then those go out to the states for ratification in the exact same way that we've ratified 27 other amendments. It takes 3/4 of the states to ratify any amendment before it becomes part of the Constitution. I've been doing this for 6.5 years. It is a long, slow road. I can tell you sometimes I'm very frustrated by that. I want it to happen yesterday. I wanted it to happen the first year that I started. I wanted it to happen when I had a little bit less gray hair. I'm starting to get gray in here from doing this. I want it to happen now. But the founders intended this to be a long, slow road. Literally, that's what they intended. If you read their writings, they did not want us to amend the Constitution willy-nilly. And they knew that society changes from year to year and decade to decade. And they wanted to make sure that we built a broad consensus across a period of years, across millions of people, across all the states, before we really got serious about changing the Constitution. And then they wanted that any of those proposals to go out and have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. It's a really high bar. So every time I get frustrated, or if you're a volunteer and you're engaged already and you get frustrated, remember, it's exactly how the founders intended it to be. I want to tell you a story from American history that will give you a sort of a picture of how I look at all this. You know, I study a lot of American history. You guys raise your hands, you guys do too. One of my favorite periods in American history is obviously the American Revolution. Like, how did that happen? How did it come to be? There's some incredible stories. We know a lot of the stories. They're sort of part of the American lexicon. We know the stories of Madison, and we know the stories of Adams, Abigail Adams, Sam Adams. We know the story of Washington, the indispensable man. One of my favorites, we know Patrick Henry. He was such an incredible, amazing, eloquent speaker. You know, we know his "Give Me Liberty" or "Give Me Death" speech. We know all these stories. I don't think that's the real story of the American Revolution, though. You know, when you have something like a revolution, a major historical event, there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that participate in the making of that story. We know only a handful of stories. So I think we don't get a real perspective. And I like to try to dig into history and find out what was going on with regular people at the time. You know, in the American Revolution, they estimate that about 1/3 of the population actually supported the revolution, right? So it's 2/3 either didn't, about 1/3 didn't, and about 1/3 were just neutral. So about 1/3 of the population participated. And there are a lot of regular people like you and me. And my favorite story from the Revolution is about a guy by the name of Captain Levi Preston. Preston fought at one of the original battles at Lexington. And he was a farmer. He ultimately became a captain in the Continental Army. He had a family. He was 23 years old at the time. And the only reason we know his story is many, many years after the Revolution. In 1843, he encountered a guy by the name of Mellon Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a young school teacher at the time in 1843, collecting stories from the last remaining Minutemen in the Revolution. And if you think about it, at that point, they were in their late 80s and early 90s. Now, look, I know a lot of people that age now. They're still sharp. In that time, in 1843, that was like Methuselah old, right? It was pretty rare. And so to come across a guy like this, he knew if he didn't preserve their story, those stories would be lost. So he's going around collecting the oral histories of these guys, and he comes across Preston in North Carolina, and he asks him a series of questions about the American Revolution. He asks them, Captain Preston, when you went out to fight those redcoats that day, what is it that you meant? Had you been reading the great revolutionaries like Burke and like Paine on Common Sense? And he said, Preston says, those men you speak of, I never heard those names. We read the Bible, Psalms, and the Almanac, but those men, I know not of them. That's pretty shocking, because I heard they were reading all the great revolutionaries. He asks him, what about the Stamp Act? Were you frustrated by having to buy the stamps and put them on your documents? It was a form of tax. It was punitive. And he said, stamps, well, Governor Bernard locked them in the armory. I'm sure I never bought one. I mean, I don't know. That's what I learned in school, right? They were furious about the Stamp Act. He asks him about the taxes on tea. He says, you were upset about the high taxes on tea. And he said, tea, I was a farmer and we never drank any tea. We drank coffee. The boys dumped it in the harbor and that was that. I don't know about you guys. That's everything I know about the American Revolution. That's what I learned. And so I think Chamberlain's frustrated and he asks him this question. He says, well, maybe it was just the heavy hand of British tyranny and you were just sick of British tyranny. And he says, tyranny, never felt a whit of it. So he doesn't feel tyranny. He never bought a stamp, didn't drink tea, wasn't reading the great revolutionaries. Everything I know about the American Revolution is right there. That's the whole thing. And he asks him, well, why did you go fight that day? And Preston says something that I think is the most eloquent, succinct summary of the political philosophy of the American Revolution, said then or even to this day. And he said this. He said, son, when we went out to face them redcoats, we meant only one thing. We had always governed ourselves, and we always intended to. Them redcoats, they intended that we shouldn't. That's the whole thing. That's the idea of self-governance. It's uniquely American. That does not exist in the psyche of any other country, this idea that we are a self-governing people. It's a recognition that comes from God. We're endowed with certain unalienable rights from our Creator, right? Free will, that's where we get free will. And we believed that in our bones at the time of the American Revolution, and it was enough that a guy like Levi Preston, who was not a soldier, who was just a family man, a farmer, he was willing to come out and put his life on the line for that concept. And I think that's extraordinary, and I think it's really, really important. And there's a reason I tell this story. I've told this story hundreds of times, maybe over 1,000 times now. And I'll never stop telling it because I am Levi Preston. Because you are Levi Preston. Because we're just regular people. It's like you read about George Washington. I can't imagine being George Washington. The indispensable man, the character, the intellect, the fortitude. I can't imagine being Patrick Henry. That guy was so eloquent, such an amazing speaker. I can't imagine being Adams or Madison, the incredible brain power, the breadth of knowledge, the years of study, the books read. I can't put myself in their shoes. These guys are icons. We almost deify them. Levi Preston, he's just a guy that knew that he was supposed to govern himself. Just a regular guy. That's what I am. That's what all of us are, right? Maybe you can picture yourself as Washington. I can't. But I think all of us can picture ourselves as Levi Preston. And Levi Preston, he was willing to go out on the field of battle that day because he'd always governed himself and he always intended to. And I think that's where we're at in American history. Anybody feel like the federal government and even the state governments are impugning on our ability to govern ourselves? Yeah. You feel it because it's true. The founders would have never tolerated what we're tolerating right now. It's unbelievable. No income tax back then, and they were worried if we ever imposed an income tax, it might go as high as 1%. There's writings of the founders that were outraged by the idea that it might be 1% someday, right? And they've done all this stuff to us that's so outrageous. So for me, I say we return to the Constitution. Go back to the Constitution. It gives us the power to do this, to take back our government from these people that have taken it away from us. Now, I get people that say to me all the time, this is a regular occurrence, Mark, but the thing is, if we would just follow the Constitution we have, then everything would be okay. And what makes you think that they're going to follow whatever you do if we don't follow the Constitution we have? And I will tell you that I always ask a question in response. My question is, which Constitution are you talking about? That's the response I always get. Exactly. Everybody looks like, what does he mean by that? So I'm gonna show you what I mean. Victoria, can you bring that book up for me, honey? This is my helper, Victoria. Thank you, dear. So this is a pocket Constitution. This one's bound. It's a little bit fancier than what most people carry. Anybody carry a pocket Constitution? There are more people with pocket Constitutions in America today than any time in American history. We should be encouraged by that. This contains that amazing, beautiful, eloquent, simple, easy to understand Constitution with all the amendments. This particular version is exactly 30 pages long. It's an amazing document. So when we say they don't follow the Constitution, are we referring to this one or the fundamental question? Are we referring to this one? Most of you probably don't recognize this one. Okay, this Constitution says on the spine, I'm not making this up, the Constitution of the United States of America, Centennial Edition. It weighs over 10 pounds. It's 2,738 pages as of this printing. This was printed in 2012. With supplements, it's now over 3,000 pages. This is the Constitution followed by the government of the United States of America today. This one, not this one. Okay? This contains every case ever issued by the United States Supreme Court telling us what this means. Most people don't know this. I've taken this to congressmen. I've taken it to state legislators all over the country. I travel with this. Not easy to travel with, but worthwhile traveling with, right? This is my workout when I'm on the road. I travel with this. You know what's in here? In there are cases like the Obamacare case that said a tax is a tax except for when it's not a tax. In here is the Obergefell marriage decision, somehow saying that after thousands of years of history, marriage is no longer between a man and a woman. In here, I think one of the most important and obscene cases is Roe versus Wade is in here. So when people say we don't follow the Constitution, they're wrong. We follow that one, not this one. So the fight is to get this one back to something like that one. I'm going to tell you one of the most outrageous cases in the history of the Constitution, which most people don't really know about, and it's responsible largely for the size and scope of our federal government. In the 1930s, there are quotas being put on how much wheat farmers can grow. They're not able to grow as much wheat as they can. They're actually federal government quotas that tell them that they can't grow as much wheat as they want. And there's a case called Wickard v. Filburn in which a farmer in Ohio grows wheat for his own consumption. And so he's not going to sell it. He's not giving it away. It's just for his own consumption by his family on his own farm. The federal government gets wind of this and they impose fines on him because he grows more than he's allowed to grow according to the federal government. And he says, you can't impose fines on me. I'm growing wheat for my own family and you have no jurisdiction over my family. And they said, of course we do, according to the Interstate Commerce Clause. And he says, interstate commerce, I'm not selling anything. I'm certainly not selling anything across state lines. And they said, exactly. That seems pretty weird. And they said, because you're not buying wheat, because you're growing it for your own consumption, you are thereby having an effect on interstate commerce. Which means, and this might sound crazy to you, That means that if you don't do something, you've now done something, and the federal government can regulate you. Which is insane, right? I mean, just straight up crazy. And the Supreme Court said that, right? So that's in there. And today, all these departments operate under Commerce Clause authority. The Department of Energy, the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce, the EPA, the USDA, the FDA, all these other alphabet soup agencies. Where is the authority in here for those agencies to exist? There is no authority for those agencies to exist in here. And I'm going to give you the absolute proof of that from none other than Thomas Jefferson. If you want to get a really interesting look at American history and see what it was really like back in the founding days and then the constitutional era, look, there's a great series of letters between Thomas Jefferson and one of his best friends, William Henry Lee. And there is a letter between the two of them where Henry Lee suggests that Jefferson ought to get money for the University of Virginia, which he's founding at the time as a proponent of public education. He ought to get federal money for UVA. And Jefferson says, well, I can't do that because that would be unconstitutional. The federal government has no authority to spend money on education. That would require a constitutional amendment. And you could look in here, there's only 27 amendments. I've never seen the Education Amendment. Any of you guys ever seen that one? Doesn't exist. That's Commerce Clause authority. So part of what we're doing here is let's take the Commerce Clause and take it back to its original meaning and get back to the enumerated powers and reduce the size and the scope and the jurisdiction of the federal government. That's why I'm committed to doing what I'm doing. I'm committed for my parents who are still alive, for my kids. I have a son that just came out of the Marine Corps. He's now at Scalia Law at George Mason in Virginia. I have a daughter who's a senior at Hillsdale College. They're both in the fight. They're good, conservative, young people who are worried about the future of their country. I'll close with this, and then we're going to take a bunch of questions. One of the most poignant things I've ever seen in my entire life was watching my son take the oath of office. Do we have any veterans, folks in the service in here? Thank you guys for your service. You're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. So my son did 4 years in the Marine Corps. And I remember when he took his oath. And it was pretty traumatic for our family when he did it because he literally got called away. He was on a list and he called me up and said, hey, Dad, I'm going to boot camp in an hour and a half. We literally got an hour and a half notice. And so he was gone. And this was just before Christmas 5 years ago. And so he was just gone. The sergeant picked him up, took him away, and we got to go down to Sacramento and watch him take his oath. And for those of you guys who've done it, I mean, it sounds like it's a big, serious thing. It was him in a tiny room with an officer giving him an oath, and it was over and done with. But something stuck out to me when he took that oath. And he swore an oath, and I'd never paid attention to this before that moment, but he swore an oath to defend the Constitution, not the federal government, not the president, not the government, not the flag, not the Marine Corps, to defend the Constitution with his life against all enemies, foreign, there's a U.S. Navy guy there, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that's a lifetime oath, by the way. Every guy I've ever talked to in the military says that's for life. That's not just for right now. And so when he swore that oath, I remember sitting there watching him and thinking, if he's willing to do that, if he's willing to sign that ultimate on the dotted line, he'll give it all, the least I can do is this. And so my commitment to him and my commitment to you and to the country is that I'll never quit. I signed my own oath between me and him, and that is that I will never quit. I will fight for this republic until there is no more republic to fight for. So I'm going to close with that and open it for questions. Thank you guys for being here. We'll go to our Navy veteran. And you guys try to be loud with your questions. I'll repeat them if you're not loud enough, but it's helpful if you guys can be loud.
Just wanted to comment that during the days when our former U.S. Senator Brock, what's his name, was in the White House, the number one foreign enemy and the number one domestic enemy was the same.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Where would you say, as far as accomplishing, where would you say we are as a percentage? Like, how far How close are we, or how far?
So it takes 34 states to call. We're at 15 right now. So almost halfway. We are currently moving right now. There's a few legislatures that are year-round. You guys are one of them here, I'm sorry. Those are all the worst states, I gotta say. And so we're currently moving in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. I'll actually be testifying in Wisconsin next week. I think before the end of the year, I'm always loath to make predictions, but I think we'll get 2 more states before the end of the year. I think we got a really good shot in Michigan and Pennsylvania, either right before the end of the year or right after the beginning. So that would take us to the halfway mark. I have a whole bunch of other states where we've passed in one house or another in any given session. You have to pass both houses in the same session. So those are places where I feel like we're already on the path. My goal, and I'm going to say, admittedly, I'm always optimistic. I'm a glass half full kind of a guy. I'm trying to get it done by 2021. And I think we have a lot of momentum that could make that happen. But I'll do it as long as it takes. It's supposed to take a long time. It's supposed to be hard. Yes, sir.
I understand what you're doing, and I respect it and commend you for your actions here. I'm curious, what effect do you think term limits would have on this whole mess that we're in right now? Would it be helpful?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question in case everybody didn't hear it. The question is, what effect would term limits have on the whole mess we're in right now? I think term limits alone would be a really bad idea. And I would say that based on coming from California and seeing the effects of term limits in California and the 23 states that have them now. A lot of studies have been done on term limits in the states, and what we find is, at best, there's no net benefit. It doesn't slow the growth of government. It doesn't change really anything. Here's the negative, non-measurable effect, in my opinion. If you impose term limits on elected officials, but not on bureaucrats and staffers, what you end up with is the lobby class and the bureaucrats and the staffers in control of government. And the revolving door is just the elected officials, and they get outlasted by the bureaucrats. So our resolution that calls for term limits says term limits for government officials. And the reason for that is I believe term limits require term limits on staffers and bureaucrats as well. Because unless you churn the whole machine, you don't get fresh ideas, and you end up with a class of elite rulers in there that are less accountable than our elected officials. Ma'am, right in front of him there, in the purple blouse. I've been doing it for 6.5 years now. I got stamina. Yes, sir.
Are those commitments fluid though? I mean, just because you got a commitment out, they could drop it, couldn't
Yeah, so the question is, once a resolution is passed, can they drop that? And the answer is it would take the exact same effect or effort. They would have to pass a joint resolution in both houses withdrawing the resolution. So they can be withdrawn, but it's not easy. It takes a big grassroots effort, just like we did. And so what that would mean is, just like we did, they would need a grassroots army. I still have the grassroots army in place in each of those states. And I actually, it sounds crazy, I like it when they try to rescind. We've had a couple of places where there've been some buzz because it keeps the grassroots in the game. Yes, sir.
Why wouldn't states really want to do this and claim back their power? I mean, I would think it would be an easy sell to the states.
Yeah, you and me both. The question is, why wouldn't states want to do it? It seems like an easy sell. Like, my sell is, you want more power and money in the legislature here, right? And the answer is, there's a couple of answers. One is tribalism. So Democrats generally, I'm speaking generally because we do have some Democrats who support, but generally Democrats look at what we're doing, and I don't blame them for this, by the way. They look at me, I'm a Tea Party guy. They look at Mike Ferris, he's a conservative evangelical homeschool guy. They look at Mark Levin, who is one of our endorsers, and Ben Shapiro. They see all these conservatives and they naturally go, oh, I don't like that, right? Those are all conservative people. So I get that. Some of it is just they actually like the power in DC and they like not having the responsibility for themselves. This is something that's actually surprised me. I didn't believe that was going to be the case. A lot of them believe in centralized power and they see themselves going to Washington, D.C. and participating in the power. So I thought from a human nature perspective this would be easier than it was, but I had to learn along the way. All the way in the back.
Save this republic. We must save the vote. The vote can no longer be electronic, where these machines can be this way or that way. The vote must be by paper ballot. The ballots must be kept in storage so we can all check to make sure that those ballots have not been lost and have not been changed. The people voting must be American citizens. The rolls must be clean, so people move from here to there, they're not voting again. This is what's just happened down in, I think, what was it, Kentucky? They put in, what, 200,000 votes? And then there have people that aren't even in Kentucky, they're Democrats and they're voting?
Yeah.
And this is documented.
Yep.
So we're never gonna get our country back until we get our votes back. That should be the number one amendment to the Constitution. One vote, one person, paper ballot, legit.
Showing ID.
I got no argument with you.
What's the role of the petition process to force the politicians to take vote and take action?
So the question is, what's the role of the petition process to force the politicians to take action? Really, all that politicians care about is getting reelected. That's their number one thing. And so what they need to know is that they have a whole bunch of constituents that care about this issue. The truth is, on 95% of the things that they deal with, nobody ever contacts them. They literally hear from nobody on almost everything. And so by hearing from you guys, when you guys fill out the petition, that petition automatically goes to both houses of the legislature, to your representatives, to your senators, and tells them that you're in support. We provide to each of those legislators a list of all the petitioners in their district so that they can see that there are a mass of people who care about this, because to them, those people are votes. And it's not just your individual petition. They know that you have other people that you communicate with. But that's what we use those for, is to show them that there is a base of support in their district. And we go and we meet with them. We bring them copies of the petitions. We always try to bring in somebody from their district who is a constituent. But that's the most basic pressure mechanism on a state politician.
The politician that comes to Washington immediately gets a nice salary, very nice package of benefits that I believe stays with that politician forever. Are you seriously thinking that these politicians will do anything to jeopardize their safe position, their nice benefits package, and so on and so forth? And I'm not talking about people who are coming there just to feel power, raw and, how do you deal with that? Because this is a human nature, and human nature is a difficult thing to fight.
Yeah, I actually think on a political basis, human nature is almost impossible to fight. And so the answer is, this entire process is designed to route around those people. In other words, they have no involvement. Those folks in Washington, D.C. you're talking about have zero involvement in this. It specifically excludes Congress and the president and the courts. And the founders put this in place because of exactly what you're talking about. Because they said, look, these folks that are going to be in the central government, they're going to have no incentive to fix anything. And so we need to route around them. So calling a convention of states is the only way that we get control over the federal government without their permission. I agree with you 100%.
But you're talking about the process. I'm talking about the result. The process can be that we will adopt the amendment, and the amendment will pass, and the term limits will be instituted.
Right?
But that would just mean that the bureaucrats and the politicians that come to Washington to be our quote-unquote rulers will be multiplying, say, two term limits, two terms. So every 2 years, every 4 years, the representatives will be changed completely. So the new batch will come in and will get the same power, the same benefits, the same feeling of belonging. And we know about the revolving door. So they will be dispersing into the lobbying companies to lobby their former colleagues. This is how you see the result?
So two comments on that. This is actually, and I was surprised to learn this, common misunderstanding. They can't go there 2 years and get lifetime benefits. It doesn't work that way. After, I believe it's 12 years, they get about 40% of their salary in benefits. So 2 years, they get zero. That's the way it works. And so if you set term limits up low enough, I think we ought to remove lifetime pensions entirely from them, which is something we could do through the convention process. The second thing you brought up, I think, is actually more important, which is this rotating or revolving door into the lobby class. And I think most people misunderstand the influence of money in politics. I actually like money in politics. I want more money in politics. In the last presidential cycle, we as Americans spent more money on potato chips than we did on presidential politics. And I think that's a mistake. More money means more information. That doesn't pollute the system. What pollutes the system is what you're describing. So if I'm a congressman and I've got a bill coming before me, and let's say it's a big defense contracting bill, McDonnell Douglas, and they want to build a jet or whatever it is, it's worth $20 billion. And I'm a lobbyist. I go into the congressman's office and I'm wearing a $3,000 suit. On my wrist is a $20,000 Rolex. This one's a Timex, by the way. And I talk about how, I'm having a little trouble with the new Beamer I bought. And, me and the family are going out to Martha's Vineyard this weekend. You ought to join us sometime. And what I see as a congressman is that guy's making $1 million a year. And I'm sitting here, I'm hardly making anything compared to that. And then I say, if I'm the McDonnell Douglas guy, you're pretty good at this thing. When you leave, have you ever thought about being a lobbyist? And now what that congressman's thinking is, I need to vote for whatever that guy's pitching because I want his job when I get out. I think we need a lifetime ban on anybody who's been elected to Washington, D.C. ever serving as a lobbyist. And we can do that through Convention of States.
I imagine if the Convention of the States addresses the Commerce Clause, then all the affected federal agencies, if they're not disbanded, whatever regulations they come up with would just be suggestions. The states won't have to follow them. And all the regulations they have deemed as law in the past would no longer be law. It would just be suggestions. Is that correct?
The question is around the Commerce Clause, and if we were to restrict the Commerce Clause that I was discussing, essentially what would happen to the agencies? And if they continue to issue regulations, would those regulations just be suggestions? What would happen to the regulations that have been issued previously? Is that correct? Good way to put it? So two different things. What would happen to the regulations previously issued? I think they're separate issues. And then what would happen if they continue to issue regulations? On the previous ones, that would likely be dealt with by amendment. And so what I believe would happen pretty much for any amendment we're talking about out of all of this is there would be a period of phasing in. In other words, you would cause way too much chaos if you just said everything the Department of Energy has ever done is gone tomorrow, right? The country would go into chaos for any department, frankly, because they've inserted their tentacles so deep into our society. And so I think there would be a phase out, and they would talk about how long of a period of regulations that have been previously issued they would phase out. So I think one, it would be a phase out. The second is what would happen to any regulations they create in the future? And the answer would be they wouldn't create any, because what we would be doing is removing the authority of that agency to exist. I think one of the fundamental problems that we have in America is the growth of the administrative state. The administrative state is largely unconstitutional, according to founding constitutional principles. The courts have given the room for the administrative state to exist. It's a creature of the courts. The courts themselves, in a way, have become administrative agencies. We have courts within administrative agencies. I think all of that is unconstitutional. And when you remove the authority, if you say the Commerce Clause goes back to what it was originally intended, those agencies would no longer have constitutional authority for their existence. They would have to be phased out in much the same way. So they wouldn't have the power to promulgate even suggestions anymore because they would go bye-bye. Yes, ma'am.
They would go back to the state. I mean, the state would have to deem if that was what the state wanted.
Yeah, so I'm going to phrase that as a question. So then would all that authority go back to the states? And the answer is yes. There's a really interesting nuance in American history that I think most people miss. You guys, most of you are probably familiar with the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson over what kind of country we're going to be, right? Hamilton saw a society based around urban centers, and Jefferson saw a society based around an agrarian society. So dispersed authority versus centralized authority. This was the debate of the day between Hamilton and Jefferson. The thing that most people miss out on, we think, oh, well, Hamilton won the debate. And that answer is largely true. But He never intended for anything to be even remotely like what we see today. Here's something that Hamilton and Jefferson both agreed upon. They agreed on something called exclusive spheres of authority. In other words, if a state can do it, then the federal government does not have the authority. And if a federal government can do it, then the states don't have the authority. In other words, the idea that you could here in Illinois regulate the environment and the federal government could have the EPA regulate the environment, that both of them would have said that's crazy. The idea that you have one tax scheme that you pay to your through your state legislature and then one that you pay to the federal government, they would have said that's crazy. No human being can deal with a myriad of regulations like that. So we've just drifted far away from the ideas of the founding. Somebody way in back has had their hand up. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, in Illinois we have 7,000 government agencies. So giving the power then to the state, does that enable them to create more?
I think the answer is yes. And I know that's not encouraging, but let me explain why I'm in favor of that anyway. And remember, I come from California, so it's the same. Yeah. So it's exactly the same thing. I mean, California, Illinois, you can't tell the difference most of the time. We had nicer weather in California. That might be about it. Here's the deal. I'm a federalist. And here's what it means to be a federalist. We live in a federation of states. And that federation of states, they act as independent sovereign states. And when they fail individually. And what that means is if you live here and it goes really poorly, like it kind of is, you can do what I did and you could pick up and move to Texas. Not always easy to do. I don't want to say it's easy for everybody. If people have family obligations, there's monetary reasons people can't move. I get that. But we are more free now to do that than we are if every state operates under the same set of rules and laws and regulations. And what I want is, for example, California, my ex-home state, to fail. They're going to fail. I mean, we see it right now. They're turning off the power, and people without power for days at a time. The state's on fire. I mean, it's literally like the end times in California. By the way, the house I sold in California, I closed on that 1 week before the fire started. And I live right near where those fires are, right? And so, but it's like Armageddon. So what I want though is California should pay the price for that. And it doesn't entirely, and here's why. We talk about federalism. Everybody knows what federalism, right? You got the federal government and the states. But we have a weird kind of federalism in our country now, and I call it cartelized federalism. There's a cartel of states that works together to take power away from all of the states. Illinois is one of these states. So Illinois, New Jersey, California, New York, all the northeastern states, Connecticut, Delaware, Vermont. And what they do is they create such burdensome regulations for their own citizens, such high taxes, all this stuff. And then what they do is they go to the federal government and they say, we can't compete anymore. So please impose these regulations on all of the states. And so that's a cartel that they create to do this. And we saw this in reverse with when they took the tax deduction away for property taxes, right, and your income taxes in the states. Why do the states like that tax deduction? They love it because it allows you, as a resident of a super high tax state, to deduct those taxes from your federal income taxes. Well, why is that fair? That's not fair for people in Texas. That means people in Texas are paying taxes because they don't have state income tax in Texas and they're paying more. It doesn't make sense. And so this is that cartel. And so by taking power away from the federal government and giving it back to the states, you break up this form of cartelized federalism and you force the states to more stand on their own. There's an amendment, by the way, that I think needs to go in the mix of this. It doesn't get talked about very much, is I think we need to prevent the states from ever being bailed out financially by the federal government. Because otherwise, I promise you, Illinois, California, Connecticut, these states are going to get bailed out, and then everybody in the country is going to pay for that. Yes, sir?
Don't we need to give the states the right to file bankruptcy if you do that?
I do think we need to give the states the right to file bankruptcy. And I think it's a problem that we don't have that, and as a lawyer, I don't really understand why. We have a part of our bankruptcy code that allows for municipal bankruptcies. So we have cities and counties all over the country that have filed for bankruptcy. And it's worked for a bunch of them. They've been able to rework their finances. But we don't have that for states. And I think we do need an edit to our bankruptcy code to allow states to file bankruptcy. You got a question right here.
Speaking to bankruptcy type of thing, one of the biggest things I'm concerned about is our national debt and what amendments are being, thinking about being proposed to
Right.
deal with this giant gorilla.
So the question is about our national debt and what amendments are being proposed to deal with that. To me, that's the biggest problem right there. And I think we actually look at the national debt incorrectly. I think this is the moral issue of our time, the ultimate moral issue of our time. I look around, I see the young ones in the room, and we're imposing our debt on them. Like, nobody in this country would honestly say that that's a moral thing to do. To look at kids and say, we're going to spend money now, we're going to make them pay for it later, and they won't get anything for that money. It's immoral. It's been immoral since the time of the founding. The founders specifically talked about that. And ultimately, what can't continue forever won't. And this is not, eventually, I don't know what causes it to crash, but it is going to crash. You know, today we have, 21.4, 22 trillion in debt on the books. And we have, a few years of the Green New Deal, right? Actually, just a couple. And then we have 140 trillion of off-book debt. And so the question is, what can we do about that? And I think by proposing things like a balanced budget amendment, by proposing things like limitations on spending tied to population plus inflation, or taxation tied to gross domestic product, these are ways to limit the spending. It's actually not that hard to get this under control. My biggest frustration today, right now, is what Trump has done to the economy is generating record revenues. We literally have record tax revenues right now. And we are spending more than the record revenues. It's really outrageous. And I will say more than anybody for that, I blame Donald Trump and the Republicans. This is why we need constitutional amendments, because that's the best we're going to get, and we're not going to get this under control unless we get it under control. Yes, sir.
Mark, I wanted to thank you for coming to Illinois. Many of us here watch our beloved state lose 350 people a day, and some of us here just refuse to throw our arms up and say something has to give. Projecting COS where we're headed, what type of misinformation and noise and threats do you guys feel is going to happen as we get 30, 31, 32, 33, 34 states calling for a national convention so the states can take back control of our beloved liberty?
Did you guys get that? Okay, so the answer is it's going to get as ugly as anything you've ever seen. They're going to try to impeach me, but I don't hold office. So, no, there'll be, and they already exist, there'll be personal slanders on the leadership of the movement. There'll be tax audits, I have no doubt. Google will shut us down. There's going to be every kind of pressure you can possibly imagine. And I expect it, and we are already getting it. What we're getting now is you have 2 years ago, 230 progressive organizations led by Common Cause and Center on Budget and Policy Priority issued a press release saying this is the worst thing that could possibly happen in the United States of America. We get called racists, we get called Nazis. I've been down in the South where I was told what we're trying to do is raise up a new Confederacy. So we're going to get all of that stuff. Look, there's no important fight that's ever happened, ever, not just in the history of this country, where it doesn't turn into something like that. And what we're doing is we're talking about, and you said this, we're taking power away from people that are going to clutch that power with every bit of their beings. I expect the IRS will be used against us, the FBI, the CIA. I mean, when I work with my technical team, we're pretty good technology-wise. I just tell them, unless you're locked down like the NSA, then it's not good enough, because we're going to have the NSA come after us, and the CIA and the FBI. Look at it, it's not, and by the way, it's not just the government and it's not just the left. I can tell you that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't like us, right? And that's a business interest. You would think they would like us. They're not going to like us because they like centralized power. All the unions will come against us. The AFL-CIO, the SEIU, they've already all signed that press release against us. So I expect it's going to be good and ugly. And I expect to take that heat personally. I can tell you guys, I'll stand with you as long as you'll stand with me. I'll never stop standing as long as you guys are there. What it's going to take, really, is just millions of us. Millions of us can get this done. And it doesn't have to be the majority of the country, right? Remember that only 1/3 of people were really working in support of the revolution at the time of the American Revolution. And that 1/3 saved the country for everybody else. So I'm willing to stand if you guys are willing to stand. Yep.
When you were on Levin, you kind of made the comment that at the beginning, to get closer to 34 critical mass, on the other side of that equation, you think both things like that?
Yeah, look, so the closer we get, the question was, as you get, I was on, I don't know if you guys saw this, I was on Mark Levin's show, his Sunday show, me and Senator Tom Coburn. If you didn't get a chance to see it, watch that one, it'll give you a good background. And there was, Mark brought up that, don't you think it'll get also easier as you get towards critical mass? And I think the answer to that is yes, as well. Look, the hardest thing about this is just telling people about it. When I travel around the country, I travel a lot, and I'm on an airplane, I'm sitting next to somebody, and I tell them about it. It is very rare that they already knew about it. And I travel a lot. And so when I'm not in a room like this, I'm just talking to people. Most people, Article 5, what is that? And people just have no idea. And so the hardest part is just getting the message out. This is why you guys are so important, right? Because if each of you tells 10 people, imagine how you would feel if I come back 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now, and each of you brings 10 people with you, or 8 people with you, and we have 500 people in the room, right? That's what it's going to take. That's how you build a critical mass. That's how grassroots works. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Mike.
Hey, Mike.
District captain in House District.
Thank you.
And so I've gone around to my community and I've talked to some people, and I know I went to the last meeting that we had downstate Bloomington, and you said that we should focus on the low-hanging fruit. So not necessarily trying to convince a socialist, someone who believes in that ideology.
Yep.
But to really find people who already agree with us.
Yeah.
And so I agree with that. But I also go to school at DePaul, and so I was looking for my ilk. I was looking for people that might.
Yep.
And I thought, well, maybe the campus ministry. But I was wrong, because actually part of their mission is social justice, and actually they participated in the climate strike.
Right.
So would you recommend trying to engage with those people at all? I know it's not the most important, but and have you heard any stories involving universities where people kind of gained awareness of convention of states?
So did you guys catch that? Everybody get that okay? Okay, so he's a student at DePaul. He's a district captain. So thank him for being a district captain. I appreciate that. And thank you for your bravery being a conservative at DePaul. Look, in the last month, I've spoken at Dartmouth and UC Berkeley. And I think those probably make DePaul look kind of conservative, comparatively speaking. But I find common ground everywhere I go. I really do. I spoke at UC Berkeley in a political science class. There were no riots. And the reason there were no riots is because they didn't announce my speech in advance, literally. And they don't, because most of the crazies, the real crazies, come from off campus and cause the problems. And so the professor just didn't announce I was coming. There were 700 kids in the class. I was there to talk about political organizing kind of generally and answer questions about that. They're all these leftist kids were really into political organizing. And I'm a professional community organizer, so that means I might be president. Yeah. I mean, who knows, right? And so I heard that's one of the qualifications. You guys would know. And so we had a good discussion about that, and about halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, the professor said, hey, Mark, can you tell them about Convention of States? And I did. And I actually wasn't really planning on talking about it because my subject was just organizing. And when I was done and the questions came, the only thing they cared about was Convention of States. They had 0 questions about organizing. They were fascinated about taking power away from the central government and giving it back to the people. And so if I'm going to talk to people like that, I'm going to talk to them in their language. So I mean, even something I just said, it's so 60s and hippie-ish, power to the people, right? That's what we're talking about, taking power away from the man and giving it back to regular people. And so I will say to people on the left all the time when I'm talking to them, do you like President Trump telling you what to do? And again, step back if you're going to ask them that question, because they might take a swing at you. And I ask, do you like a Supreme Court that's more conservative, telling you what to do with your body, with your marriage, or whatever it is? And the answer is no. Do you like Mitch McConnell and 150 new conservative judges? Now, we might applaud for that, but people at DePaul are going to hate that. And then I will say, much to their surprise, yeah, neither do I. I don't like that. I don't like the idea that Washington, D.C. can tell us what to do. I mean, right now it's conservatives telling us what to do, so that might align with my politics a little bit better. But someday it's going to be more liberal people doing it, and I won't like that either. I didn't like it when it was Obama. I don't like it when it's Trump. I don't care whether the Supreme Court's liberal or conservative or Congress is Democrat or Republican. That's my pitch. And then I just say, look, the real question is who decides? Do you want to decide as a person who lives here in Illinois, or do you want Washington, D.C. deciding for you? If you think D.C. should decide for all of us, well, then you don't agree with me. Then I don't really have much to talk to you about. But if you think we should decide here at home, then you should be for a convention of states. So that's kind of my pitch. And then one more thing I want to say about low-hanging fruit. In a state like this that is so blue, it is hard for conservatives to find something they can plug into and be excited about. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you're going to go fight to take over the state legislature? Yeah, no, right? Like, you might as well just strap on the suicide vest, right? That ain't working. And so what do you fight for? And so this is something that you can fight at the local level that has a national effect. It's inspiring. It's easier to recruit people. And I'll get some of my leaders in some of my blue states, not Matthew, but some of them will be like, well, you don't understand. We're a blue state and it's so hard. And I say, how many registered Republicans in your state? Do you guys know? Anybody know what the number is here? I don't know. 2 million? I don't know how many millions, but it's a bunch, right?
In Illinois, we don't register by.
Okay. So do you have any way to know rough idea of party alignment?
All you know is look at the number of people who voted in the Republican primary at the last presidential election.
Do you know what number that is roughly?
I don't know what that number is.
Okay, I'm going to take a Svengali-like guess. It's a lot more than are involved in convention of states. And so when people say, oh, you know, it's so hard, I'm like, do you have all of those people? Because if you don't, you could. And imagine what it would be like if instead of standing here, we were standing in a room with 1,000 people or 2,000 people or 2,500 people. Imagine if we could go to the Capitol and bring 3,000 people with us and overwhelm the. We can do that in a state like this. And that's how you get it done here. So that's what I would focus on. I can take a couple more questions because I got to run back to the airport and head home. I came to you guys just for the day. Are you impressed? One, just good. Hear him back. Monica, you wanted to ask a question?
I just wanted, Mark, if people here like what they've heard today, tell them what they can do to get involved and personally help move this forward in Illinois.
You guys remember the story of Levi Preston?
Yes.
So he went out on the battlefield, right? So somebody told him what was going on. And somebody said, we got this problem and we got a solution, but it's going to require you pick up your musket and maybe get out of your comfort zone a little. He had to get way out of his comfort zone, right? And go out to the battlefield. And that's what I'm asking you to do today. This is really important. Don't come to a meeting like this and go home and say, man, that was just so interesting and exciting, and then just go watch TV. That's not okay. I need you to be Levi Preston. I need you on the battlefield. And that means there are sign-up sheets there at the table when you came in. Sign up to be a volunteer. It's not scary. We're nice people. And we won't hound you. We just need your help. And there's all kinds of things you can do. Whatever you like to do. We need people who make phone calls. We need people who work on the internet. People who are willing to enter data. We need people who are willing to go to the Capitol. We need you all to send emails to your legislators. But what you don't want to do is be the person who doesn't do anything, who complains, who's frustrated, and who doesn't. That was me most of my life until 10 years ago when I got engaged. I'm not asking you to do what I do. I'm not asking you to travel around the country or make this your life. I'm just asking you to make this a little part of your life, because there's something that is at stake here, and that's everything, right? It's not, by the way, it's not just this country. There's no other place to go, right? If this country fails, there's no other place to go. Everywhere that I travel in the country, everywhere, I guarantee you there are people in this room like this. After a meeting, people come up to me and they're like, yeah, I don't think you really know what's going on. And I say, what do you mean? They're like, yeah, you guys are not sliding into some slow slide into a socialist democracy like Sweden. You guys are becoming a totalitarian country. And I'm telling you, that's what's happening here in America. When we start talking about limiting free speech and saying what people can say and not say and what people can think and not think and throwing people out of their jobs for saying and thinking the wrong things, that's not Sweden. That's not. That's Cuba. That's Venezuela. That's what we saw in the dictatorship in Argentina. That's the Soviet Union. That's China. That's where we're headed right now in this country. That's what's at stake. And so that's why it's so important for you to be engaged. Yes, ma'am.
Email that you can send to our friends and family with a petition to sign a petition. Is this what we really need for this action?
Yep, that's exactly what we need. So I would say what you should do is go to the web page and click on the petition to sign the petition, and then just take the link for that petition and say, go check this out. Because the whole explanation is right there. That's really the simplest way I know. We've really made the process really simple. Yes, sir.
You mentioned maybe a couple dozen things that should be a part of this convention. What limits this convention so that you don't lose control?
So the question is, what limits the convention so you don't lose control? And I'm really glad you asked that question. By the way, this is the only objection we get to doing a convention of states is, it's called the runaway convention idea. The idea that you get into convention and they can do anything they want. So there's a whole series of things. I'll start from the back end and work forward, and then I'm going to take off. I'll leave you guys to debate this afterwards. So the way it works is it takes 38 states to ratify anything that comes out of convention. So I'm just going to propose that everything else I'm about to tell you is all wrong and comes out of convention something totally crazy that we all hate. Like the one I hear the most often is they're going to repeal the Second Amendment. You know, people are all freaked out about guns right now. It's going to go completely out of control. They're going to come out with an amendment repealing the Second Amendment. Remember, 38 states have to ratify anything that comes out of convention. And that means if you inverse the math, flip it over, 13 states can stop it, right? And really what it means, since both houses have to approve, only one house in each of 13 states has to stop it. And really, if you know how a legislature works, it means one committee chair in one house in each of the 13 most conservative states in America to stop anything that comes out. That's kind of how it works. Having been in 48 states in the last 2 years, I'll tell you, if you go to the 13 most conservative states in America, go to places like Tennessee and Georgia and Florida and Alabama and the Carolinas, go to the Dakotas or Wyoming, go to states like this, and you propose to them that they run an amendment to repeal the Second Amendment, I hope you're carrying a firearm. So the reality is, and I've offered this challenge, by the way, all over the country to tens of thousands of people, propose an amendment under this resolution that you believe that a conservative wouldn't like, and then show me the 38 states that would ratify it. And I've offered this all over the country to tens of thousands of people. I've done it on the air, online. Not one person's ever been able to do it. So when they say runaway, in the end, it just can't happen. The numbers make it impossible. And look, I'm a math guy. The numbers are numbers. They don't lie. Now I'm going to do the process for you real quick, and then I'm going to duck out. So look, in order to get into convention, it takes 34 states, and they all have to agree what we're going to talk about, right? In advance. And the resolution says particular things, and it says this is all we can talk about. So when you go into convention, a full 2/3 of states have already agreed in advance, this is all we're going to talk about. Each state is going to do what's called commissioning its commissioners. They're going to send each delegate, who's called a commissioner, with a piece of paper, or maybe digital, that says this is what you can and can't do. They're going to go to convention. They have the law of convention, which is the resolution. They have their commission, which limits what they can do. They're going to go into convention. Some people say, well, people are strange. They're going to just do whatever they want when they get in convention. You don't know. I mean, people from Illinois are going to be there, for goodness sake. The legislature is going to choose those delegates. People from California, and they might just do whatever the heck they want to do. And the answer is, the legislatures of the states have chosen those delegations. They've chosen people they trust. They've commissioned them the way they want them to act. The idea that they would just do whatever they want is kind of bizarre. It's weird. They're going to choose fellow legislators, former statewide electeds, judges, people they trust, right? Now, we may not like that if we're from Illinois or California, but remember, Texas is going to be there, and Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and the Carolinas, and any of them can object and say, that has nothing to do with what we were called for, that's out of order. Assume I'm wrong, they go crazy. I mean, the Californians grow some pretty good weed, so maybe they bring a bunch and they're all smoking it in convention, right? And it gets crazy and they do something that's out of order. The state legislatures are going to be watching the convention the entire time, every single minute. It's going to be right there on C-SPAN, on their phones, on their tablets, on the monitors in their offices. And if it gets out of control, they can withdraw their delegates at any time or instruct their delegates at any time. I don't know, maybe the states all decide they're not going to watch convention. That seems absurd, but this is the argument of the runaway people. Nobody's going to pay attention anymore. Now you need to get 26 states to agree, a majority of states to agree, whatever it is, like to repeal the Second Amendment. You can't name 26 states that would repeal the Second Amendment. You just can't, but maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? They go crazy. 26 states do it. Now it comes out of convention and goes out to the states for ratification. Now you have to presume that every single conservative legal organization in the country decides we're not going to litigate that. We're just going to let it go. We don't really care. Second Amendment, who cares, right? ACLJ, the ADF, there's hundreds of conservative litigation organizations in the nation. You have to presume all of them are going to let it go. That's crazy, but maybe they do. I don't know. Maybe they're busy with something else. It's Christmas time. They're all having their office Christmas parties. And then the last thing is you have to believe you can still get 38 states to ratify it. Now, here's the final argument of the runaway convention people. They will say, yeah, but Mark, you never know. Anything can happen. That's true. Anything can happen. Look, I mean, that's just a truism, right? Anything can happen. It is actually true that I could walk out of this library today and be hit by an asteroid. But I'm not going to look up in the air when I walk out the front door, right? Because some things are so absurd and ridiculous and asinine, frankly. I'm not even going to consider worrying about it. That's where the runaway convention argument is. And I think it's really important that we know where that argument comes from, because what you are all going to hear, I promise you, from people you might respect, conservatives, you're going to hear them say this runaway convention argument. You think, well, they're a good conservative person. Why are they saying it? And I ask that question all the time because where that argument comes from originally in American history, I care about history, you should care, is it comes from Chief Justice Warren Burger. And he was asked by a very conservative woman, Phyllis Schlafly, what he thought about the idea of a convention. And specifically, he was being asked about a convention to overturn Roe versus Wade, which was a decision of his court. In fact, the seminal decision of his entire career. So he's asked, what do you think about the idea of a convention? What do you think Chief Justice Burger is going to say? Great idea, go overturn Roe versus Wade. No, he said, that's crazy. We might lose our beloved Constitution to a runaway convention. And then professors at Harvard and Yale were enlisted to write articles about the runaway convention and to insert those into the American lexicon, and that was promoted by the American left and unfortunately adopted by some on the American right. And now it's become this sort of myth that was put out there by the left to stop us from using Article 5. They're incredibly good at propaganda. Is there anybody in here that doesn't think that the Marxists are good at propaganda? Okay? And so I will close with this item and encourage you to look this up. On our website, if you go look up David Horowitz, anybody know who David Horowitz is? Okay, the #1 scholar in America on the American left, right? And so Horowitz wrote an article for us. He did the research and he proved absolutely what I'm saying is true. This is propaganda invented by the American left to keep us from using Article 5. And he finishes his article with this phrase, I'm paraphrasing. He says, "It is no shame to be incorrect, but it is a shame to be presented with the facts and the truth and to not change your position." And he said, after all, I was a communist, right? And so that's where this idea of a runaway convention comes from. If you want to know who propagates that idea today, it's every organization on the left. It's Planned Parenthood, it's the La Raza, it's the Communist Party of America, it's all the public employee unions, it's Hillary Clinton, it's Howard Dean. They all say this argument, and then you get a couple of fringe people on the right that are repeating the same argument. And so it's impossible for there to be a runaway convention. It literally just cannot happen. And we got to stop folks on the right from stopping us from using it. With that, I know there's a couple more questions, but I literally have to run to the airport or I'm going to miss church tomorrow. So thank you guys. God bless you. Go to conventionestates.com, press the button, sign the petition. More importantly, get 10 of your friends to do the same. When you sign the petition, then that sends a letter to your state legislator. You go on the list in their district as a supporter. We deliver those lists to the state legislators. It means something to them.